I got, I got, hold on, an astrology video for you today as well. So there's the Ruroni Kenshin characters, right? So those characters are Kenshin Imura, right? So he is a Gemini, and he was born on June 20th. So when he was born on June 20th, that meant that, Kenshin Imura is a guy who likes to use his brain a lot. He thinks a lot. He has a lot of, information to give people and, feedback. Like people can, really learn from him. He don't mind having a conversation with anyone. But he also learns his, swordsmanship, right? The Hiten Mitsurugi Ryu style, very well. When he didn't, he questioned, why he was, this way and why he was that way. Not really, getting the last part, but he had to, learn, and he learned, and he used that to defeat Shishio. Now you know that if you watch the '96 version, but if you only watch the 2023 version, hey, know this: it's gonna get, good in season 3. You know, it's gonna be action in that, right? And that's what I know about. But anywho, he's a Gemini, born on the 20th of June. Those Geminis are ruled more by, um, they're ruled by Uranus and a little bit of Saturn too. Those Gemini's right there at the end. So he is, disciplined in his art of, you know, um, Itamitsu Ryu, right? And he keeps up with his training because he keeps his sword on him too. The times might change, and he understands that, but he's like, not, we gotta keep that, on us because that's a part of who we are. It's important. But, you know, he is a Gemini born in those last decon. See, I'll talk about that in the video too soon. The decon. So that was the last couple of degrees that he was a part of, right? He likes to talk to people, take in information. He learns, quickly, and he can, help other people understand things because he's, learned his, art very well. Now, Sanosuke is a Pisces. Sanosuke Sagara from the Sekio army became, a vagabond, a vandal, but he was still, out there, protecting himself and doing what he needed to, for his life. And he believed people should, live their lives without being, stepped on or, being looked at as, whatever, right? And he's a good guy, and he's always there for Kenshin and shit. So he shows compassion for other human beings and shit, that kind of thing. When that's a Pisces kind of trait, having compassion and what understanding that somebody comes from something, and he does think like that, and I'm seeing it. I'm like, okay, he was born on February 18th, so he has that cusp with Aquarius too. So he's like, yeah, this guy's a Hicho Kiri, but he threw that life behind, and it's still there because it's a part of him, and that's some shit that Pisces would understand, right? The kind of wisdom they understand, from the past. This is why you are, today, and they like don't get it, but they understand that it comes from shit like that. He's a little bit intuitive in that kind of manner, but he's also there to protect his friends, to protect himself. He's ballsy and shit, right? He breaks shit with his hands. Almost, he almost loses his hands during training, and he's, training like that. He likes to not limit himself, which is a good thing. He's a good character in that manner, and he shows that, Piscean, Aquarian energy really well with the cusp. With the cusp that comes before, it's like you have your birthday on, like his birthday's February 18th, and then the next day it changes into Pisces. You have a little bit of that Piscean energy too going on in your chart with that. So if you're a little bit different than them, you know why. You favor that shit a little bit too. Because I know I have some social planets. That's what I have. But anyway, he's a guy who has fucking guts too. See, those last Pisces, they the ones that like got some real guts. They're down to like do it no matter what. That's why he's willing to go through that pain and sacrifice for to get that shit done, right? And really, hammer that home. But he ain't the best, He's young too. But Kaoru, the girl Kaoru, this girl is a Aquarius. Oh wait, she's a Cancer. Actually, she's a Cancer on June 28th. So she's a Cancer on June 28th. If she's a Cancer on June 28th, that means she's one of those true Cancers. She has that intuition. She's like, you're a Hitokiri, right? And he's like, or you're, know about the manslayer. He's running around. But then she's like looking at this guy because she, kind of, likes him and shit. But she's looking at him and she's like, okay, hold on. There's more. You are not a Ruroni. You were something else before. And she was, taking, note of that. And, eventually it came out that he was, the Hitokiri with Tosai, the real one, not the fake one. And she was already, like, interested, intuitively and all that, right? So he, or she, this girl, June 28th is her birthday. So she's a true Cancer. That's what you call that, if it's in the first 10 degrees of a sign. And that's what she's an example of. Very, home care taking person. She took him in and, fed him and, hey, you're injured, let me take care of that. Had some, compassion, some, what's the word I like to use for them? Great care. They really did. She did. Not just romantically, but as a human being. She, took in other people too a little bit. Yahiko and Sano a little bit. She needed the help too. She was, a supportive bro. Just like Cancers are. Now, we got Saito. Hajime Saito was born on February 18th. Sanosuke was born on the 22nd. And then Saito was born on the 18th because he's an Aquarius. He's the one that's Aquarius. He knows how to... God damn, this guy knows how to, like, uphold. He has a sense of justice about himself. So, see, he was a part of the Shinsengumi, right? Since he was a part of the Shinsengumi in the past, he understands the sword better than other people. And it's, like, died out, and it's not the same anymore. But he's, like, just like Kenshin, he's like, well, I still have to, do my job. And, like, a job nowadays requires me to cut down these, like, old manslayers who want to, like, bring destruction to the country. So that's what he does. And that's, like, his sense of duty. That's very, because these last couple of degrees of Aquarius people, the people who have Aquarius there, in the last, if they're in the last decon, the third decon, Aquariuses, those Aquariuses have more, Venus-like energy. So he's doing that, he has a family now and shit, or he has a wife. So now he's, changed up. He's, gotten a new job and still taking care of business like he did back in the day as a Shinsengumi member. Just less of the slashing and only at, particular times because he was still, valuable. And he knew that. See, he's an Aquarius with the Venus, like a sense of duty. So then it worked out real well for him, the transition. But it was still tough. And he talks to Kenshin about it, and he takes note. He's like, you're not the guy you used to be, telling him some facts and shit too, right? Because Aquarius likes to do that too. It's like, you were not, like you used to be back in the day. That would have been a real fight, saying shit like that. That's a very Aquarius-like energy, but saying it because it's important, Shishio's a killer, and we gotta make sure we're on, par. And you're supposed to be stronger than me, apparently, but you ain't, and that's how he thinks. But the next character is Miss Megumi. See, Miss Megumi Takane was a caretaker, but she's a Virgo. See, Miss Megumi Takane was born on September 12th. So she's a Virgo, right? But Miss Megumi Takane, she likes to think things through. She likes to analyze situations. So she had to jump to a guy named whoever because she thought she was making a move. She thought she, accounted for everything, and she was like, I'm just a just a caretaker. I'm a doctor. I'm a nurse's, physician. Kind of shit, right? And she's running around, acting like that, but she's also underground, giving, drugs and shit, the shit you don't like, the white Spider and shit, White Widow, you know, the opium shit, because that is what was going on back in the Bakumatsu, or not Bakumatsu, either, the Meiji Restoration during that. And she went to Tarukane, I think his name was. This guy, or not Tarukane, the other guy. I forgot what his name was, but she had to be with him because she felt that that was more secure, and she knew that in the long run it would be all right. But then, Kenshin came through, and she developed feelings for him a little bit, and she, took care of everybody else. She didn't want to be a bother, so she left. Shit, right? She was kind of being secretive about it, but she really cared about them and shit too. Um, but she, had done the drug thing, made the fucking opium. She actually made it. So, like, because she, was good at doing that kind of thing, like medicine and all that stuff, right? And she was, doing that. But then, she turned around and became a real doctor and saved lives instead of taking. And it, like, played on her, like, character in that way. And she was not doing shit like that anymore. She was actually taking care of people, sewing people's wounds and other things. And that's, she's always showing up in that way too. That's her sense of legacy that she wanted to uphold, because her family she comes from a long line of those doctors. She was the last one left. And that's something you gotta know if you watch the show. And that's why she's, Virgo like, and she's like one of the middle. She's of the middle decon, so she's the second decon Virgo. So she's about her, getting that shit done, and sticking to a schedule and being disciplined. She's doing that out of, the need to, man, survive. But she didn't want to do that. She had to come with that, that played on her, heartstrings a little bit, what she stood for. And Capricorn's very like that too. And she was like, no, I'm, gonna do it right, and leave that legacy and shit, right? So, and a bit traditional like that. But Yahiko is a Capricorn, born on January 17th. So, Yahiko, Myojin, he comes from, samurai lineage, but he was, his dad and mom was killed after, the Meiji stuff. They couldn't, pay their rent and other things. So then he, ended up being a burglar, pickpocketer. That's what he was. But then, we met Kenshin, and he was, moved by him. He was like, "You're an actual samurai, still." And he's like, you need to learn the ways of Kaoru, because she don't, do the killing, and you don't understand killing. But he's like, I don't care, I want to, fight with you guys. And he's always there trying to fight with them, side by side. Anytime they go into battle, he's trying to be in the mix. And they're like, they got to throw him away to the side because he's only like a 10-year-old boy. And they throw his ass away. But, he's still, taking that, sense of duty thing, because Capricorn has that shit too. When they got to, move towards, becoming a better samurai, but also understanding the timing too, and that it's not time yet. And he's still, an honorary little boy saying, I need to fucking do this shit now, because I want to, handle that shit now. And that's what they're doing and shit. This guy also, he thinks a little bit, but he's young. He's really trying to be like those samurai and shit. He respects the legacy of his, father. That kind of thing. And you can see that with Misao. Misao is Misao Makamichi. She is a Sagittarius girl, so she likes to look for new experiences, but not in that kind of manner. A little bit, I guess, but she likes to run around and try to be like the Oniwaban. She was interested in that, but when she was younger, she was held back, and she didn't like that. She wanted to run around with Aoshi Shinomori and, Hanya and all these other guys and try to kill people. But she's a young little girl of 5 or some shit, because now she's 15. And she's like, I want to, do that shit now. And she's very excited about meeting them and all that. Oh, wow, the guys were, cool. They were, great people. But, she meets them, and then, or she meets Kenshin, and she finds out that it was, not that. really, fucked with her a little bit. But she actually stayed, she put on a brave face for everybody else. She was like, it don't affect me that much, and we gotta, worry about the Kyoto fires and shit. And she was really, on board with that. Aoshi Shinomori had become a slaughter. He cut down Okina, who was taking care of her. That's like her grandpa and shit. So she was upset about that too. But she, buried all that. See, that's a very Sagittarius thing, because guess what? They don't want to show their emotions in that kind of manner when something serious is going on. But she still shows that anyways, right? Because also fire signs can't hide that. It comes out eventually. Whatever they were actually experiencing or trying to experience, that, emotion comes forward, right? And it's hard to hide and shit, but that's why they get irritated and they're like, moving and shit like that. But they like to, experience new things. She was trying to become a member, but now she has to be the leader of the new Oniwabanshu. And that's also a Sagittarian like thing. They like to lead by, positive influence and like, that kind of thing. But this person, right, the next person is Aoshi. Aoshi Shinomori is born Capricorn January 3rd. See, he's one of the later, or the middle. He's in the middle right there. Almost a true Capricorn, but he's like very, dead set on, being, the best, right? So he has that, he's a more consistent or more like Taurian kind of Capricorn, because guess what? That's the Venus. The second decans of Capricorns are more like Taurus. They're more like Taurus because they're ruled by Venus, but in the introverted way, because they're both introverted yin signs, right? So this guy, who is called Aoshi Shinomori, he got hung up on the fact that he wasn't strong enough, which, he wasn't strong enough to protect the people, in his group. And, they knew him to be the strongest Oniwa Banshu member, and he led them and other things, and he was trying to, like, really, bring that shit, back and survive in the Meiji era. But shit went south when, guys have Gatling guns and, and he's just, a fucking little bitch, and he has to bring that out, right? So then he gets upset at himself, and he's like, I have to kill Kenshin more because I wasn't, fast enough to take him down. I let them down. Had I done that, now I have to kill him. And they're like, no, don't hunt him down and shit. Everybody's like, don't do it because he's trying to fight Makoto Shishio. And he, he joined up with them just to make sure he could get that, right? He even cut down one of his, teachers too. He had that, revenge he was trying to go after. Not even revenge, he was just trying to, like, become, he believed he needed to be the strongest and shit, right? So he believed that he needed to, beat Kenshin, and then he would be the strongest. That's what they, seen in him, and he, had that loyalty to them, and it was important that, actions be taken, his actions specifically, and that he was going to do that. It's that kind of action, very Torian like, but, he's, a strong, willed person kind of guy. He went through his, rough patches and shit, but, you'll find out in season 3. Seijuro Hiko is a Libra. So Seijuro Hiko was born on October the 1st. Seijuro Hiko is a type of Libra that he's one of those more Aquarian, like he questions things a little bit more. And like he tries not to, like he's a bit more weird too. A little bit. Eccentric is what it is. Those Libras are more eccentric than the other ones. Because that's an Aquarius type of vibe, eccentric kinds, right? A little bit awkward and shit, but it's alright, because he ain't just fucking like that. He's the guy who taught Kenshin Imura how to use Hita Mitsurugi. And he went through a certain training regimen with him every day, and it was consistent, and he always tried to, let him know, you shouldn't do that, it's not the right time, and you could get really hurt from that, and he's having communication with his student who's like, like, but we have to do something because we're samurai, right? And we learned all this for a reason, and he's like, the reason's not for now. It's, you don't have that sense of justice that I have, and that's also what he brought up with him too when he came back later. Your sense of justice was a bit different than mine, but you still, came back and shit like that. So he was like, I'll teach you. But he's like, you have to kill me or I have to kill you, for the last thing. And he's letting him know. But, things worked out. And then he's like, just, you have to, take care of that business with Shishio. So you better do it. And we spent the time together. And, you now know that, Hito Mitsurugi. And he's trying to give off this little, what he wears and shit. He has his own fashion sense a little bit. And then, Kenshin's like, nah, I don't fuck with that shit that much. But I'll, be, me, I'll take him down. They had that good, communication and shit, almost like a father-son bond because he found him when he was young and he gave him the name too. He was like, this is your new name because that name, ain't like samurai's and you're going to learn how to be a samurai. He had that time to, talk to somebody, very Libra-like energy because they're, ruled by Venus. They don't care about, sometimes they'll just have a conversation with somebody who's all alone and shit. They'll be the only one to, even, consider it. He's kind of considerate and taking him in and then becoming that, and he, ran that home, too, for Kenshin as well. But, he's one of those kind of Libras, a little more eccentric, but really, cares about his fellow human being kind of thing. And still holds his, kind of duties too. He's like, I like times of peace, so he doesn't like that kind of shit. So he was gonna help out against Shishio too. Now, the last guy is a villain. His name's Aoshi Shinomori. You gotta look at this guy, not look at him, he's fucking, he's tough. He took Kiri after, Kenshin went into hiding and shit and became a Ruroni. But he, you know, damn, it's gonna be a tough fight. But if you watch the '96 version, you know how it's gonna end up. Read the manga, you know how it's gonna end up. He's a Leo. See, he was born, August 13th. So he's one of those later Leos, right? So he's very aggressive about how he, takes his power and becomes, the ruler of Japan eventually, because that's what he wants. He doesn't want to just get revenge. He wants to do all of that too. Take control of everything. Very aggressive with how he handles, his business, right? Burning people. That's the shit that gave it away. He has a fiery personality too. He likes to really, let it be known that he's, somebody that's, not to be, played games with and shit, right? But he's also, calculated too. So he's like, he has a circle, the 10 swords, and he's like, you can protect me from anything that comes my way. And as you're fighting, I'll even watch so I can learn from you, and then I can, handle this business myself because I'm also a great swordsman too. And he knows that shit. But Kenshin Imura, it's one of those. That's actually one of the best fights in anime too. But once that comes out in season 3, we will be talking about that shit again. I hope so. I will. But this guy is a Leo, one of the later ones, a little more aggressive, like Aries, right? And really driven towards his goals. Passionate about him. He keeps a bitch by his side, and he's like, I have to take over, Japan. And you're gonna be there with me, no matter what, right? We're doing this, and that's what it is. And she just stays there and other things, but that's Shishio. He's one of those Leah, and they all, each one of these characters, some of them are, a little more, true to their signage, and then other ones, are a little bit. They stay true to their signage, but they show, traits of another sign a little bit, Taurus, or the same type of energy. They're ruled by their Venus sign, kind of shit, or they're ruled by their Jupiter sign or Aries sign, or Aries, Leo. That's very more aggressive kind of Leo because it's like Aries ruled by Mars, so they rule by their Mars sign. Those individuals. But yeah, man, that was all of the characters from Ruroni Kenshin that I wanted to talk about. Those were the characters from Ruroni Kenshin. There's 11 of them. I'll let you know their signs in the comments, and then let me know if you have any of those signs as well, and if you want to know a little bit about that sign. Those characters. There's 11 of them. I'll run them by again. Now it's Kenshin, who's a Gemini. Sanosuke, that's the Pisces. And Saito, that's an Aquarius. Kaoru, that's a Cancer. Megumi, Takane, that girl, that doctor, she's a Virgo. And then you got Yahiko, who's a Capricorn. And Misso, who's a Sagittarius. And Aoshi Shinomori, who's a Capricorn as well. And then you got Seijuro Hiko as a Libra. And you got Shishio as that Leo. But, let me know what you think about these characters in the comments below. And let me know also if they have the same birthday as you. And that's another astrology and anime video by me. So be cool, comment.